Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dharmendra Kanani. I'm Chief Operating Officer and Chief Spokesperson, your moderator for this afternoon on this very topical discussion, day after European Media Freedom Day or Global Media Freedom Day, whatever, one of those symbolic days that we have, and a day after we are here together. Also, I've learned that the European Parliament have also launched a report, which hopefully the gentleman will be here to be able to share findings hot off the press around it. That's you, great, wonderful. Basically, what do we want to do today is talk about how do you sustain an independent and free media? What are the routes to funding? How do you sustain it? How do you cope with the onset and ferocious pace of digitalization, and in a world where journalism doesn't have the same doesn't have the same kind of panache because everyone feels that they're a journalist. Everyone can record something, everyone can be in a place and shoot something and put it and post it on social media. What we do know is the pace of news development has shot through the roof. It is happening at a pace which none of us in, let's say, my generation, I'm older than most of you in this room, would ever have countenanced about 20 years ago. And what we're also witnessing is a silting up of very, very rich, mostly men, owning a lot of the global media and squeezing out the independent and almost, let's say, independent, free, let's say, libertarian press. And what we are thinking about right here today is that how do we cope with the sense of politics that's shifting in our world at the moment, and the fact that whilst the internet has democratized so much, and it's been a force for good, it's also been a force for bad. And suddenly, information and news has shifted into being weaponized and been a source of disinformation. And we see daily let's say, the disinformation wars between East, West, North, and South. And in that context, where we know that printed media is almost out of fashion, we know that a lot of people, I think only about a fifth of Europeans will actually pick up a newspaper and read it. What we do know, though, is that the older generation, which is no great shakes really, is that will still rely on local and national media and will read news. But our younger generations, let's put it this way, are not consuming the kind of news diet that we might have once expected. So the issue of how we consume information, how we consume news, who reports on it, how much do we trust it, and how do we make sense of it in this current context, whilst looking ahead to the future in terms of what are the models of sustainability for an independent free media? How do we make sure that we're able to create the right environment and an enabling environment? Because one of the things, and perhaps is it a role for government, is independent free media a social good? And do we see it as a bedrock of a free, well-running democracy? And how do we sustain that? These are some of the big questions I think we need to address, and not only just with the panel, but also with you in the audience, which I will be calling upon, and I hope that you can make the most of it. I also want to welcome our live stream audience. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that, if you have a question or whatever, join the hashtag FoEDebate and post a question if you'd like to, or make a comment. So what we have is a fantastic panel. You'll notice, obviously it won't have gone past your attention, it's all men. And let's just put it out there. If you read the programme, there were women on the panel. We never, as a policy, have a manel. But unfortunately, the universe has contrived against us, and we have one of our speakers broke a leg and can't join us, and the other one's stuck in a plane. So I'm hoping that she'll join us. Mira will come towards the end of the debate. But, there we are. Thank you. So I just wanted to kind of make sure that we don't ignore that, because we have a very strong commitment to never having manels, and we always have 50% women on our panels. So our apologies for that, but we're going to try and make sure that we can sort that out, but it's just circumstance. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to have the ambassador here with us. And obviously we're doing this in partnership with the US Mission. So we're really pleased to be able to have had this opportunity to discuss funding free media. Ambassador Mark, thank you for joining us. Could you share with us your thinking on why this matters more now than ever, potentially? What are the issues for you when you think about your role, but also what's happening globally?
Well, thank you, Dharmendra. First of all, thanks everybody for attending, and thank you for hosting us, and thank Friends of Europe for hosting us. I will answer your question. I have a few minutes of prepared remarks. I will try and keep them short because I want to get the colloquy going, and especially with the audience. A couple of sort of introductory points. First of all, it's a real privilege to be the U.S. Ambassador to the EU at this moment in history because I think the relationship between the United States and the European Union has never been stronger. And I think it's built, and this in part answers your question, that relationship is built on shared values, a commitment to democracy and the rule of law, respect for human rights, economic opportunity, and the security of our nation member states in the two largest democratic systems in the world. The topic of today's event is one that's very near and dear to my heart. As some of you may or may not know, I was U.S. Ambassador to Romania, and when the President-elect called me after he was elected and asked me what I wanted to do, I said I wanted to be U.S. Ambassador to the EU, and he said, "Really?" And I said, yeah, what I learned in Romania is that the multilateral institution that does the most to bring democracy and the rule of law and anti-corruption regimes and preserve fundamental rights like the freedom of expression and speech was the European Union. And I wanted to be a part of that process, not knowing that Vladimir Putin at the time had 200,000 troops on the Ukrainian border and that would become something of a distraction. And it has indeed in many ways overwhelmed my mandate. But I was determined to stay on that topic if I could. And I think the need to preserve freedom of press and promote transparency and accountability has become even more evident in recent times. Media is a powerful tool to keep governments in check. It is often one of the first to be targeted by autocrats and malign actors. Russia continues to use disinformation to justify their illegal war against Ukraine and the spread of disinformation. Russia's goal is to convince us that truth is what they say it is, and to destroy the credibility of independent media, which could say and would say otherwise. Even in member states, and you're going to hear more about this, it's a pretty grim picture from my friend Frank. At home in the United States, journalists are not only being persecuted, but media institutions are in very serious shape. A recent report from the Council of Europe found that a 60% increase in detained journalists from 2021 to 2022. That's what we're seeing in Putin's Russia with the wrongful detention of Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal, and I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate the Secretary's call that Russia should immediately release Evan. To Russia and other autocracies around the world, I would add one comment. Why are you so afraid of the truth and of truth tellers? On Tuesday, during the World Press Freedom Day, Administrator Power of the USID launched the Reporter's Shield, a groundbreaking new initiative to defend investigative journalists from legal threats intended to silence their reporting. Applications for membership are on the web right now. You can go to reporters-shield.org. You should take a look at it if you're a reporter or in the media business, and you can sign up. But here is a hard truth, and it's in part an answer to your question. Free and independent media cannot prosper without sustainable sources of funding. In other words, a reliable income stream. This is why my team and I have been talking to the EU, to Friends of Europe, and other civil society actors and media organizations about what we can do to support a free and pluralistic media environment in vulnerable countries where democracy is backsliding. In March, at the second Summit for Democracy, USAID joined forces with Internews and Microsoft in a public-private partnership to create a media viability accelerator to help media outlets sustainably support themselves. The platform will provide smaller media organizations access to media market research, insights, and business solutions to inform their business strategy and to withstand economic shifts and shocks. While governments certainly should do their part, we must also work to ensure alternative revenue streams that secure financial viability of independent journalism across Europe and are free of editorial interference. In some cases, state control of advertising revenue has driven independent outlets out of business. It is not enough for government to be prohibited from outright repression or manipulation of the media, but a robust, free, independent, financially viable media is a pillar of democracy. My president, in his speech last weekend to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, said it well when he paraphrased one of our founders, Thomas Jefferson, and I quote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I would choose the latter." Same here. A little strange coming from part of the government, but I do believe that. What we need is a platform that brings together news organizations and potential investors to further explore sustainable business models for preserving a free, independent, pluralistic media environment across Europe and beyond. I know Frank and Joaquin will speak to this, but what we have on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly on the US side, is a market failure of significant impact. You're going to hear a great presentation by Frank and others about why this ideal is threatened in the US, but I would argue it's threatened here as well. And I'm confident that the rest of the panel will discuss how the differences and the similarities on both sides of the Atlantic provide a basis for a dialogue where we can literally learn from each other. And I think the focus needs to be on the very difficult problem of creating a diverse and sustainable media environment for the future. It is truly existential. Nothing less than our democracy is at stake. I look forward to hearing on the insights of all the experts from today, and thank you all for coming and caring about the future of our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Much appreciate. Can you hear me? No, great. Much appreciate those comments, and especially that choice quote. It's interesting that you should say that you favoured the option that you did, but it's powerful. It's powerful because it points to the centrality of, let's say, when the Chartists and others came about and created a modern free press. The importance of speaking truth to power could never be more important now than ever in the times that we live in. But the digitalization aspect we mustn't lose sight of, because I think that is going to shape and contour our media consumption and our news consumption, and we're not going to be able to turn the clock back on that. That's for sure. So thank you for that. And I'll come back to you with the audience also to talk about, because what you're alluding to is the fact that the market has failed, clearly, but in that context, is it a social good? Is it a public good that government should step in with the private sector to ensure a sustainable model of independent free media? And I think that is a conversation we haven't had a lot of, I think, historically, but one that we should turn to. So now I have the great pleasure of inviting Frank to speak to all of us. I've been looking forward to this because if anyone's been, following the history of, the media in the US, you'll know that this man stands out as, someone who's stood the, I suppose you've stood the test of time and change. And you've maintained your independence. You've been through so many controversies. And you're a bit of a hero and a man of history, Frank, in the fact that, you're still here, standing here. And that's not to do with the fact of aging at all, Frank. It's to do with the fact that, you have been a tall poppy in a field of, dryness to a certain extent, and also something where you've seen this kind of almost monopolizing of media in the hands of certain people. So share with us your views and thoughts on what's happening now. Why is it so important right now in the United States, but also what's happening in the United States as a proxy, I think, for the rest of the world in terms of what's happening more widely. Over to you, Frank. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. That's very kind. And thank you to Ambassador Gitenstein for inviting me, but also for his awareness of how fragile democracies are becoming as our free press, our free and independent press struggles to survive, both in America as well as in Europe. That's been unusual in my experience in government circles. They seem to be the last ones that sometimes are getting the alarms, because we have reforms that could restore the independence of the American free press. We just seems that people like Google have so much money that they can throw at legislators that people are not going where they ought to be going. So back to my notes. This has become a very critical issue in America. There's only a few independent newspapers truly left. We were once the home of the world's strongest democracy. And it was a brilliant democracy based on strong local self-government and citizen engagement. Local citizen engagement, which is created by the trust you get from an independent local newspaper. And what is created, collectively created, our national passion for democracies. In America today, there are three sort of overriding causes of the collapse of our trusted system. The first is the loss of newspaper stewardships to absentee financial mercenaries who have massively disinvested in local journalism and journalism staffs. A little more on that later. The second is the monopolization of digital advertising by big tech. This illegal monopoly has destroyed the local newspapers' dominant stream of revenue. Third, the inexcusable failure of successive presidents, congressional leaders, and regulatory agencies to deal with the loss of local newspapers to the absentee financial mercenaries. America's civil fault lines and deteriorating civility have not been this bad since our Civil War in the 1860s. It is ironic this demise has not been driven directly by political corruption, but rather by American capitalism run amok. Capitalism which is destroying our once trusted local newspaper system while enabling unfettered, irresponsible social media and embracing destructive digital advertising monopolies. Our founders built the American democracy on 4 pillars: localism, a national system of independent newspapers, 2 newspaper stewardships as the foundation for robust self-governing communities, local engagement which would fuel national support for American democracy. Subsidization. Local newspapers would be subsidized to ensure an informed and engaged citizenry. To foster engagement, the founders created postal delivery as their neutral subsidy to deliver newspapers. Interestingly enough, they did not make a distinction between rich and poor. They did make a distinction on literacy, which is the third point. They increased literacy was critical. This is, of course, back in the 1776. Hence, the Founding Fathers doubled down on federal investment in local common schools. Fourth item is freedom of the press. To protect our new system, they enshrined freedom of the press in the U.S. Constitution. It is the only business enshrined or mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. A system which was intended to always have local stewardship and never become part of non-local financial investors' portfolios to plunder and destroy. Trust and localism go hand in hand. Consistently, local newspapers have been the public's most trusted source of news and information. It's only human nature that we trust people and institutions in our community that we're familiar with and that we know. Even through the Even through the first half even though half of the country has become news deserts and ghost newspapers, people still cite their local newspaper as their most trusted source of information. To restore trust, local civility, and strong local government, America needs to rebuild its once vaunted system of local newspaper stewardships. The downward spiral of trust began in the 1960s when the U.S. Congress created a confiscatory death tax rate of 70% on all family business assets, including family newspapers. Local newspapers could not afford to pass the papers on to their heirs as a consequence. And that's when they began selling to the financial mercenaries from Wall Street. It took almost 40 years of acquisition from Wall Street surrogates to destroy our once local free press system and give rise to the increasingly divisiveness we're experiencing today in our country. The last 2 decades have been particularly bad. During this period, we lost 57% or 41,000 of our newsroom journalists across America. The death knell for local newspapers has been Google's illegal monopoly of digital advertising. Advertising which had been the lifeblood of the American newspaper system. Everyone is now looking for new revenue sources. Philanthropy and nonprofits are the darling of the moment. They do have an impact and an important role to play, but they alone are not going to save the free press. In Seattle, we are truly fortunate to have some strong foundations and many individuals and corporations that are nationally unique, are funding our nationally unique public service journalism program. However, we are an anomaly. There is not enough philanthropy to fund and sustain local newspaper journalists we need across the country. For our democracy to survive and thrive, we need to correct the systemic problems and make our rural areas and low income, and make sure we're serving our rural areas and low income urban areas. We cannot continue to accept news deserts and ghost newspapers. The step to redemption is clear. The willingness to act is unclear. While some solutions may be unique to the US, the principles are probably useful in Europe also. We need to pass a new contemporary subsidy to replace the outdated postal subsidy. We need to pass a law requiring big tech to pay us for our newspaper content, by which they're benefiting fabulously now and not paying for it. We need to reestablish local newspaper control and stewardship by requiring absentee financial investors to divest to local families and groups. We need to end big tech's debilitating monopoly of digital advertising. We need to exempt family newspapers from federal and state death taxes. We need to allow in corporate and donations for public service journalism to be paid directly to newspapers and not taxed. We need to create a federal fund or even some state funds for newspapers to be provided to impoverished neighborhoods and with free local print and digital subscriptions. We need to create a fund to provide grants to local communities, creating startups, newspapers where news deserts and ghost newspapers exist. You'll actually be hearing about that later on from Joaquin. Recreate the postal delivery system, especially in rural areas and low-income inner-city areas. Create civic literary centers to teach low-income communities, especially in the urban areas, how to use both digital and print newspapers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So yeah, because I was completely concentrated on you, and I lost the moment there because you're almost like you've put together a manifesto for change. It's a kind of I don't know how many points you had in there, but each one is very specific and real. But it made me think, how will that play out in the America of today, or in the so much has been made ugly, and I can say this because we're an independent think tank. So much has been made ugly by Trump and the era of Trump, and we've seen how in terms of manipulation of the news agenda and the information agenda, that cutting out the middleman and directly tweeting and using social media created a very different dynamic, and I suppose placed the power of disinformation in one of the most significant world leaders that we have at the time. How will that play out, your agenda? Will it be seen as kind of a Bernie Sanders type thing that, my goodness, this is far too left-wing and will never work? Does it have any traction amongst the young generation? But also, the question for me mostly, so there's a political issue for me, but the second one is digitalization. So much of what you're saying, I felt that didn't necessarily capture the fast pace of digitalization of our independent or just media consumption per se. So politics and digitalization, if you just touch upon those two things.
Yeah, well, it's, I think I mentioned it took 40 years for the consolidation to get to the point it is today. And when you mention Trump and politics, Trump is a creation of the loss of local news. Every poll you've ever seen has local news the most trusted source of news for the reasons I said. So now there's only a handful of us left across the country. And so people are going to Fox News or CNN. And
make sure you hold it because we have people. We don't lose your wise words.
And especially when you think of, I always have to remind people, rural America and inner city, poor urban areas get really overlooked when it comes to where they're going to get credible information. And if we don't recreate that local system, credible newspaper system that people trust in America, we're in deep trouble. I mean, we are in a downward spiral. And, it's just insane that after the insurrection, Trump is still saying, in the rape accusations and trials, that he's still wanting to run for president. So it didn't get this bad overnight. It's not going to get cured overnight. But the kinds of solutions that I'm talking about are the ones that really need to be done. And the most important are the top ones, where we actually can get big tech to pay for what they're stealing from us now, and benefiting mightily from, and we can get some kind of government subsidy equivalent to what the Postal Service has always done, in that it is neutral. It doesn't matter what your paper's, view is. If you're a mainstream paper, you can be liberal, you can be conservative. But people, once they come together and start trusting their own local community, they get more involved civically. And it's kind of like, why would these small portion of disadvantaged people, relatively speaking, continue to support somebody like Trump? It's beyond, I think, the cure is to recreate the free press system.
No, indeed, thank you very much. But also we've seen how it's bled into the Fox saga, and what the, I suppose we need more of that. We need more of this kind of opening up of the excesses of control and disinformation, and I suppose the culture of media, big media, in terms of how news is absolutely managed, and influenced, and also, I suppose, spun to deliver a political agenda, something that we all need to be worrying about. I'll bring you back in a moment. I want to go to the audience, because you've been patient, you've been listening. Some of you have been screwing your face up, some of you have been smiling, some of you are thinking, that makes sense. So you're not here as passengers. You're here to kind of also, you're part of the brain in the room, so I'd really welcome your views and thoughts or reactions to what you've heard. Don't look down, because that's dangerous with me, because I'll just come and pick on you. Gentleman there with the glasses, please introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, my name is Martin Vladimir. I'm representing a European Public Policy Institute called CSD, Center for the Study of Democracy, based in Bulgaria. We work a lot on media capture, and I think what you have been talking about in the US context is very well reflected in Europe, but from a slightly different prism. if the culprit in the US, the digital giants, the big tech, in Europe, it's about oligarchic control of media and the concentration of media ownership in the hands of a few, corporatist political networks that use media actually as a tool to suppress opposition, to help authoritarian governments preserve control, or to actually push through disinformation coming from authoritarian countries. So it's a similar kind of dynamics, and wherever we talk about media freedom and media capture, I think we need to follow the rule of follow the money, basically. So if you know where the money is coming from, you'll know what kind of media content you're going to get. In order to have free independent media, you need media ownership and financing to be decoupled from alternative motives, ulterior motives for financing this media. And in many cases in Europe, we are talking about media outlets that are no longer serving the purpose of informing the general public and serving the general good, but serving private interests. Dismantling that requires new alternative, I think, financing modes, including on a regional scale, so that individual media outlets don't become subject to harassment because they're too weak and too focused on one locality or in one country. So if these regional platforms like the OCCRP, for example, they're much more powerful. They can project much bigger influence, I think. Thanks.
No, thank you for sharing that with us. Yes, please, yourself. And I'm going to pick on a few people if you're not going to put your hands up, just to warn you. You don't know who it is yet. Go on.
Thank you very much.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Pascaline Gabory, Pilot for Dev. I think this is a very important discussion we are having now. There is a problem indeed of funding the media in Europe as well, especially investigative journalism, which is very important to bring the light on many, many interesting topics and to bring credible information. And there is also, I see indirectly, a second problem, which is how to protect the media themselves from disinformation, foreign influence, but manipulation of data. And in this way, do you see also threats such as the rise of artificial intelligence, for instance, and possible manipulation of information that even the media could not control?
Pascaline, thank you for making that point, but don't give the mic up. What's your view on, treating independent or media or news, independent news, as a public social good? That means government intervention.
Yes, indeed. I think there is indeed a question of not even common good, but a bedrock of democracy, as you say, pillar of democracy, so a need of funding. And the idea of local newspapers was also very interesting, as maybe if there is a distrust sometimes towards national funding, this could be European funding, local funding, civil society funding, private funding, and a mix of everything.
Sure. I suppose my only question when we think about local media, and we'll come, gauge your reactions. When we live in with a generation that it operates by TikTok and Instagram, what do you do about news when that consumption? You see, I mean, I've only watched my nephews and nieces and some of our staff, none of our staff, who go like this. It's like this. It's constant, and it's like there's a new use for the index finger and the eyes, and you can just kind of going like this, and you're consuming stuff at a rate, and that's what you're spending most of your time, and it's almost as if the AI will obviously speak to your interests, but also the clever merchants in the system, if I can call it that, will now crowd into TikTok for providing information and news, if you like. So I think that's whilst we might want to go for local and we might want to talk about local newspapers, I just challenge us to think about digitalization and social media. I'm glad I've got a few hands up. You've got your hand up as well, as a young person. Great, I'll come to you. So, first, gentleman at the back there first. Introduce yourself and then yourself.
Hi, I'm Kostas Tervenis. I'm a sales manager for Intrasoft. We're a software company. So my observation here is something that Mr. Kanani just pointed out. I think we are obfuscating technological change, which is something that happens, like transistors and vacuum tubes. So it's going to have an effect with disinformation. and what needs to be done with disinformation. So without talking about the technological change, because that would be too long of a conversation, about 10 years ago, Bill Gates was successful in passing legislation internationally, he funded it, that the intentional violation of copyright be prosecuted as a criminal act. And it's evident in many countries right now. Okay, here in Europe, I can think of, I think, 17 or 18 countries that have copyright protection laws where the intentional violation of copyright can be construed as a criminal act. Should we consider legislation to the extent that the intentional dissemination of disinformation, especially where it causes harm, be penalized criminally under penal law, not civil law? Is that something that should be considered?
I take your point, but when we think about TikTok and Instagram as a new phenomenon, okay, I take it it's technology change or technological advancement, but how do you deal with something that's that popular, and in terms of making sure you're trying to bring those who are doing it to court? I think there's a complication that we need to perhaps think about. But we had quite a few hands, so sorry. There was a gentleman there with a tie, white shirt. Then I'll come to you, and then yourself, and then to you.
Hi, Jeff Lightfoot. I'm the Bratislava-based director of the Center for International Private Enterprise in Europe. And this is a really interesting subject. And we had a convening a few weeks ago in Bratislava that some of the US-EU staff were here for, and Patrice's team and others. And one of the interesting things we're seeing in the region around the media model is, I guess, a recognition that some of these technology trends that you pointed out, Frank, are a reality and an unfortunate one to deal with. So what can you do about it? And two interesting things that we're seeing is brands who are realizing in the sort of disinformation context, it's really not good for my brand to be affiliated with a site that's toxic. So there's a lot of money that can be made in disinformation, right? There's political purposes, but there are companies or individuals or news outlets that are making a lot of money, and then the algorithmic system of how modern ads are bought sort of pushes eyeballs to that, and it ends up being quite prosperous. And so we're seeing brands say, gee, we didn't really know how this worked, and can public affairs agencies or the buyers of media that they're working with help them figure out how to navigate this? And this is where it gets kind of tricky from a political perspective, because some of these groups are creating sort of exclusion lists, saying, well, you know, we've rated these and we see risk here, right, from a political perspective, so it's not good for your brand to invest over here. And then hopefully Mira will show up later, some really interesting work on the inclusion list side of things. This is where, you know, Internews or Ads for News and others are sort of thinking about what are the sort of trusted brands or trusted outlets where global brands can work together. And this is what's interesting is we're seeing, I think Martin pointed out some interesting examples in the Bulgarian context, but in Romania and Slovakia, some public affairs agencies and their brands trying to team up together. And this is what we're trying to do is, can we bring those groups together to learn what's working, what's not working in semi-captured contexts, much more captured contexts. Like we see interesting things in the Czech Republic where there's some oligarchic capture, but it's not as repressive as a place like Serbia. So you see some entrepreneurs come together to try to support independent outlets. So there's an interesting, I think, level of entrepreneurship and innovation going on, including media. I think one of the other points you made, Frank, is in the US it's really tragic, is I think this loss of community engagement and feeling that's perhaps fed by a lack of local media. And so you're seeing some small hyper-local outlets that are almost making clubs as a source of revenue, but also a source of way of bringing people together and creating trust in their local community. So I think we're seeing interesting sources of innovation, but I think the challenge would be scale up to this point. How does it start to make a much bigger
Who does
difference?
the scale?
Well, the scale, that's an interesting question, and I think that's where you could have...
Would you like it to happen? Would it be government?
I'm not...
Can you use social impact bonds? Can you do what kind of investment vehicle could you create? I'll come to you in a minute.
Well, I think that this is where you can have, I think Patrice will have really good thoughts on that. This is where some groups like Ads for News is partnering up with Group M and some of the big ad agencies to try to do this at a larger international scale, and you're seeing some donor coordination. So this is one question. I'm a little skeptical on government because I think there's a trust issue that gets into all of this that I think makes this really tricky to implement at a local level. But the innovation is there. At a local level, the question is how do you scale it?
Great, thank you very much. Lady here. Again, please do introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. My name is Marta Checa. I'm editor and journalist for Equal Times. It's a global news media based here in Brussels. And one of the points you briefly mentioned, I think is very important. I mean, in the long term, I think we need to work on the education. Education for me is crucial. It's like a training at schools, universities, secondary, and everything. So for instance, here I know that the Belgian Association of Journalists, they do trainings at schools, and just to, familiarize kids with media are. Because one of the things is this, they don't know what we are. Much of the people are using just the information that other friends send out, and that's it, but they don't know what media is. So in my case, my daughter sees me working every day, and she sees my job, but it's not as clear as it seems. So many of my colleagues in other organizations in the building, they don't know what journalists we do actually. I mean, it seems something that is very clear for us, but it's not necessarily very clear for everyone. I mean, it seems it's funny what I'm saying, but I met many people who really don't know how we work journalists. So for younger generations, I think it's vital that they really understand why do we need media, what we are, how we work, all the codes of ethics, everything that, in our daily lives, because otherwise it doesn't matter how much money we pour, no one is going to read us. So if they don't know why do they need to come us as a source of information, doesn't matter if I have a budget of 1,000 euros or 1 million, it doesn't matter. They are not going to read us. So education for me is actually one of the crucial points in the long term. Of course, the short term, we need money. So can I say how many media are represented here today? Because I see many other professions, but media journalists, so my gosh, okay. All right, thank you.
It's a good number. It's good. No, but your point is very well made, because actually the mainstream curriculum does not accommodate what you're talking about. It's it's elective. It's if you're interested in communication, studies or media studies. But you don't, as a part of, we don't do proper. Well, I'd call it philosophy and ethics in school. We would have to call it that, but it's understanding how society works and what's important, and the notion of an independent, free media and why media is a pillar of democracy. We just don't do in school, and I think it's something that we need to be thinking about very seriously. Gentleman here.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, Dennis Kuiper. I think...
Your name's what, sorry?
Dennis Kuiper. Yes. I think media nowadays, it's such a crucial topic, especially, and I think what you mentioned before about TikTok and Instagram, I think it's true, and I think the main problem there are the algorithms, which are putting people in a rabbit holes of the news that they like, and so on. And I think that's the main problem, because I think we have to be honest here. I don't think we are going to go back to the penny press or something like that, because that's, I think, sadly, I wouldn't mind reading every morning newspaper, or like physical newspaper. I would love that. However, I think that the time is simply gone, and I think the media has to adapt to this and have to also try to come up with new ways how to attract the readers, because for example, because I'm from the younger generation.
You're evidently the youngest person in this room, right? So we're really pleased to have you.
And I'm a bit atypical because I left Instagram a few months ago, and also I never downloaded TikTok because that would be suicide from my attention span. So I decided that's not for me. However, I think that now, at least concerning my generation, I think most of the news that people consume are on social media. I know before, when I was on Instagram, for example, I got all my news coverage from Instagram. Exactly. I was following BBC, my newspaper. I'm from Czech Republic, so from Czech Republic, and so on. However, then when I left Instagram, I was wondering what should I do, because I want to stay in touch with the world, So then actually I think a good alternative is newsletters, because that's at least how I'm getting most of information right now, from newsletters. It's kind of like reading a physical newspaper, but digital, basically. So I think this way, but especially, for example, open source media, for example, like Bellingcat, I think are also good way how to counter especially disinformation, and because that's one of the ideas of the founders of Bellingcat was that because suddenly we have access to so many information and so many things that are going on and now you can question anything. Is it you can have different people and different framings of the situation and so on. And his idea was that basically we should using open sources for research and write it out, or so that people can construct and see how the thought process went, the conclusion that we made. I think that can also be alternatives, and that's possibly a question for you if you think that like using open sources for news reporting is a good way to go in this new digital age with so much information. Indeed. That we can have access to. But also I think that's another thing, that now we have so many news that you can go to any almost news portal and they have minute by minute. So we are constantly flooded by news titles, and especially that's another whole topic about like the catching like a clickbaits in a way of the headlines, which is also then misleading. And if you take a concept of some communication scientists which talk about monitorial citizen, for example, so it's a citizen that monitors the headlines of newspaper, and that's how he gets informed, then it can get into extent that people can get news from the headline, and that's how they inform. And then if the headline is misleading and like it's a clickbait, then there's a problem. So I think also, because I think that I think like humans should have like a little because we have so much attention we can put into something. Mm-hmm. So like a physical newspaper back in the days. Mm. Well, not so much back in the days.
You can say back in the days, fine.
They used to, you read it in the morning or during the day, and that was the whole information that you got. However, nowadays, you're constantly flooded. I felt it when the war in Ukraine started. I got updated almost a minute, but I had updates set up to update me almost a minute, and I felt like it took a straw on like my mental health and so on, because I was constantly, I felt like I'm in a headquarters in Ukraine. I'm getting informed what is going on the battlefield.
Sure.
So I think also this, like the overflow of news is, I think, also a problem.
Very interesting, Gabby. So what you're alluding to is perhaps we should put controls on consumption during the day. I can't see that happening, I have to be honest with you. And also, I'm interested, do you have this kind of conversation with your friends?
Yes.
You do? Oh, that's interesting.
Well,
that's
it's
good.
usually from my side. I'm trying to talk to them about stuff, and they know my opinion on things. And I'm trying, I don't want to say spread awareness, but...
You should. We need more people like you. Absolutely. Thank you. But I can't see it, because when I just think of... so you're a well-heeled young man, okay? You obviously have a set of views and you are interested. You're intellectually curious. When we think about those who haven't had the opportunity you have and are on this, and you see it, I mean, you will spend... you watch hours upon hours upon hours here on this, clicking like this. It compensates for loneliness, it compensates for connection, human connection, and it means you're doing something. But I think we need to have a wider conversation about what this is doing to the brain of the future, because we've got a generation that's grown up in the past 20 years, and also through COVID, that's going to change the shape of what we do. And I think that we need to be thinking about it, because what you described about Ukraine, during COVID, everyone was on there because we were getting hourly updates on stuff, and we were addicted. So we have lots of other hands. I'm going to, if you don't mind, Joaquin, I'll bring you in and others, but this is good, because this is part of them being here. So I'm going to bring you in. First, it was yourself in the red jumper or burgundy claret top.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stella. I work at the Lisbon Council. I work on disinformation and media literacy. And I was wondering, Canada just passed the C18 bill, the bill on online news media, which makes big tech pay for articles that they use on their platforms. But I wonder if that is a scalable model when you think of just the amount of news outlets that we have globally. Even like big tech companies won't be able to pay or willing to pay for that amount of news outlets. And then what does that do to diversity of the news media? Doesn't that suppress diversity? So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, whether that's a scalable idea or what you envision, because you mentioned holding them to account and making them pay for the news that they use on their platforms.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Gentleman there with the glasses, then I'll come back to you.
Thanks. My name is James Cantor from the not-for-profit EU Scream podcast. I just want to say thanks to the ambassador for doing this work to bring media freedom into to the attention of people in Brussels. Incredibly important. A couple of questions. I mean, one is that, okay, divestment, a very interesting idea, especially when we have these huge interests like News Corporation or whatever News International is called these days with so much power. But my question would be, well, and also there are German interests which are growing and really ambitious. But what about when that ownership is from a state? What about the influence of the Russians, the Chinese? And we have a very particular example in Europe where the Hungarian state exercises a de facto monopoly on media in that country. The second question I have, and again, this is a little bit to you, Frank, because there were so many ideas in your presentation. You mentioned a contemporary subsidy. How does one bulletproof a contemporary subsidy against a change of government, especially when we live in an era where we know that the other party is so polarized, and we know that that's the case in so many democracies. Where would one put that pot of money, and how would it be overseen in a way to make sure that it's still there? Even when there is a change of government. Thank you.
Before you give up the mic, thank you for those words and that question. It was a really important set of questions. What would you like to see happen? You're a journalist. You've been, you've got a lot of experience in the field, and you've seen what's happening here in Brussels and elsewhere. And let me just remind you that when you make the point about government, those of you who've worked at the most senior end of government will know that the press or communications director will absolutely have the editors of the big media on their phone, and we'll be talking with them, and we'll have lunch, and we'll go to a club for drinks, etc. We've lived through that bubble in the 80s and 90s, and that continues because about controlling the message, right? That isn't changing, even that. So what would you like to see happen? Because you also want to be a part of that club, don't you?
I mean, of course. I mean, I think that part of the way that information is gathered is that you have to be in touch with people in power, as well as you have to do gumshoe reporting and go down and meet what are commonly called the people in the street. I feel that I have a good balance of both, and we've done great work, both by holding people to account who are in power, as well as for example, being one of the few media in Brussels to go and speak with the people who were hunger striking, only 10 minutes away from here. 500 people starving themselves to death so that they could get papers to stay in Europe. So, I mean, there's a balance of reporting that one can do.
The funding, what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, to your question on that, I mean, I think that it gets a little bit to the ownership question. If states and very large corporations are the ones that are a little bit preeminent right now in ownership, then how do we make sure that there's a proper plurality of ownership? How do we make sure that civil society and other voices are in the media? So I don't quite know how that's done, but I think that part of the answer to your question is that it's imbalanced right now.
Sure. But in governments, there are systems for checks and balances. You have select committees, you have review committees, etc. Surely it's within our wherewithal that if you have a state-funded thing, that just like anything else, be subject to independent, let's say, scrutiny through select committee. But let's move on. But thank you very much. Yourself there in the blue shirt.
Hi. I'm Belle de Jong from the European Correspondent. I'm a journalist, but I'm also an editor of the Western Europe region. And I just want to tap into the debate we had earlier about TikTok and attention span, algorithms, newsletters. What we do and what I think is, well, it's the reason I'm very invested in the European Correspondent. We have a daily newsletter where we cover European news with about 120 correspondents from all over the continent, and they report where they live. So they're obviously from the place that they report from. We combine the news into newsletters and kind of deliver it to people. And I think what's so interesting about this project is that it's very young. We're like a super young team. It's basically a grassroots movement. We set it up ourselves. And again, like, this is kind of filling this gap, I feel, that might be missed by like exactly state-owned media or media that are funded in other ways. That is also exactly our problem, the funding issue. We, on purpose, don't want to take any funding from governments, obviously, but also not from the EU. We don't want to have private funding because we don't want to have big business or even small business have a sort of interest when they support us. So we're completely reader funded, and I know that's very ambitious of us because people are less and less willing to pay for news, but I do think it's a very good solution because what I can tell is that even the way that we've tapped into using TikTok and Instagram and not actually seeing algorithms as like a really evil, scary, dangerous thing, we've decided let's have our correspondents go on these platforms and try to find ways to very briefly convey the news to the people that are on here. Because these are the people that we want to reach, the young ones, the European ones, the ones that are on the internet and connected and see beyond their own borders. And so yeah, it's ambitious to do this donation funded, but I think we're managing. And I think this is one of the ways where you can kind of create a connection between journalists / media and the people by kind of going where the people are and reaching them in ways that work for them. Like was said, for example, with a newsletter or on TikTok or on these platforms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A solution, potential solution.
I hope
Be
so.
interesting. No, really, lovely. Thank you for being here and sharing that because you know when it's so easy to deconstruct society and the world that we live in, but very, very, very difficult to rebuild or build something different. And there you are. You're rebuilding something and imagining differently the possibility of doing what you're doing. I just wish you well. We all wish you well, but hopefully others will follow. That it could be a scalable thing in the world. And let's hope that that is the case. I'm running out of time, so thank you very much. I'm going to go back to our panel. So, if I may, before I bring you in, Joaquin, I will do, I promise, is, Mark, what's your view about the question that we had about, state capture, of media? How do we make sure there's, the proper checks and balances? And then, Frank, the issue of, open source news, etc., and, other matters that were being raised in the conversation. So, Mark, first to you.
Well, it's a very, very serious problem, okay? My mentor here told me a lesson when I first started talking to him about this, which I had never focused on in my history, American history, which was when Benjamin Franklin came up with the idea of a subsidy in the Postal Service for third-class mail. It was an incredibly clever solution to the problem. It was totally non-ideological. It was basically a subsidy that went right to the mail service. It didn't go to the journalists. It was ideologically neutral. The government couldn't control it because everybody got the subsidy. And it is not beyond the wit of men and women in the 21st century to come up with something like that. Now, Frank has an idea about how you would do this on the federal side, which he can explain to you, which is one solution. I actually don't know what the solution would be over here. But we better put our minds to it because if we don't come up with a solution, we're in serious problem with traditional media. And I want to just make one point about traditional media as opposed to, goes to Jeff's point about brand and somebody else's point about, about media literacy. What most people I think don't get, and those of us who are older I think do get, and I think Frank and Joaquin certainly get, when we say journalism and professional journalism, we mean journalists sitting in a newsroom subject to an editor who is saying, I want quality control. The brand of the Seattle Times is on the hook here. If we're going to run this story, it better be to the best of your knowledge true, okay? That is not what most young people are getting, most people on digital media. They're just getting information. They're not getting quality information. And if we can figure out a way to solve that problem, then instead of, one last point, just to drive the metaphor home, we have news deserts in the United States, we have news swamps here in Europe, okay? And those swamps are full of alligators who don't care, and by the way, we have it in the United States too, who don't care about quality or truth. And so that's the challenge we're after. The last person you want deciding that is the government, what's true and and what quality is. So I strongly agree with you. I don't know I don't have a solution to your problem, but I can certainly agree that it's a problem.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
I suppose and it's true, we can't solve the problem of control, but we can solve the problem of saying, in principle, when you have market failure and the issue that we're facing, government has a role to play.
Yes,
it has a role to
but
play.
the market failure is quality news. That's what the failure is. Yeah.
Frank.
Yeah.
Well, you probably,
It's on.
you brought up the one thing I know nothing about, which is open source. The Seattle Times, one of the, right now we are the, for major metros in the United States, we are the third largest. That's all out of character because it's what we have done by maintaining quality print. So our print is dying off less than any other newspaper in America right now, with the exception of New York Times and maybe the Washington Post. But we doubled down on digital in 2013 and started investing in digital, and we felt, and I love print, but we felt that that's going to be the future of the industry, and we better get on board. And we learned a lot in the early days. You could make a lot of mistakes. The audiences weren't very big. But what we've learned is, there is a key platform for digital that readers of all ages want. And actually, our two largest audiences are 21 to 31-year-olds and 31 to 41-year-olds. I don't think there's another paper in America can say that, at least the ones that we've been trying to find, if there are any. That all comes down to content, and it's what kind of content you produce and how you deliver it. And the young lady back there who talked about newsletters, a lot of newspapers are shooing newsletters. They don't think they're very good. They are a gold mine for us. It's all about doing them correctly, getting the right content at the right hour out there. We actually had a really early on a really popular morning email, and the more research we did, we found that it wasn't being open. It was being opened much more by women than by men. So we looked into that a little bit, and of course, we happened to be right next to Amazon and South Lake Union in Seattle. And it turned out it's all these techies in our community. They weren't that interested in our morning content. So we created an evening newsletter, and it's doing great. And newsletters, consequently now, are our #1 source of subscriptions to the digital newspaper. Sorry, I don't know anything about open source, though.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you. So finally, Joaquin, thank you for being so patient, but I hope you agree it was quite rich, the engagement. I told you I'd describe you as a curious beast in the marketplace. You've done the tech thing, you've done journalism, you've been everywhere, but you've created this, what I would call a strange beast in the ecology of news and journalism, Studiotobe. You're the founder of it. You've been listening in terms of, are you the new frontier or just the early posting of what might happen in the future? If so, why? But also comment on what you're hearing, because you've done a number of things, and whether you've got any solutions or ideas. They don't have to be a solution, but ideas of how we take this agenda forward.
Well, hi. First of all, this is a sign of good things, because when I used to do these panels, and we did many together, it was 90% explaining the problem and 10% talking about solutions or what are people doing. This conversation's almost 30-70. And I really appreciate what everyone sort of shared, and keep going. If you can prove it out with donations, great. If you need to go get a grant later, go get a grant. because this is a fight for survival of a free and independent press in the United States and Europe, period. We could lose, and we got a little taste in the United States of what losing looks like when we lose our democratic institutional fortitude. It's not pretty. And our collective impact on the rest of the global economy, freedom of expression, the rights of minorities, a lot's at stake here. So all of the good fight is worth fighting, and it's worth failing at, frankly, also. If you go down an avenue and you don't succeed, you guys might bomb out. And God bless you for making the effort, because you'll be that much sharper at the end. 2 quick observations. We made a huge mistake in this conversation. So I'm like the judge with like 10 points on so many things, but we have not talked about the power of consumers to make choices. We haven't. We have been talking as if consumers are on drugs and don't know what they're doing and are just going to take the bait on any piece of technology and make bad decisions. Consumers make choices every single day for themselves, their families, their friends, their communities, and we should never, ever have a conversation about the future of journalism and not put them in the middle of it, because that's where the power is, right? They are the ones spending the money, and this is why the market is such a critical space to not give up on, right? We can't cede journalism to philanthropy. There, A, is not enough, and philanthropy has its own interests, right? That's just true. And philanthropy is the result of certain tax structures in certain countries also. Those are choices from a policy perspective. The other thing that I think was, it's okay if we try to regulate and we have safeguards and we have to iterate. You would never put a piece of technology out there and say, we're not even going to look at this for 5 more years. Let's just see what happens, right? The minute you release technology, then the real work starts. As you actually get people in the real world using it, we have to have enough agility and willingness to take risks, honestly, and I really acknowledge the ambassador and the team at the embassy for getting this conversation to the foreground, because it's risky, right? There's a lot at stake with trying to regulate free speech. There's a lot at stake with trying to regulate what is journalism. But you know what? We're paying a huge price right now for the current lack of effective regulation when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and also, frankly, basic economic development, right? Do we still believe in economic development in all of our countries? Because we're not helping media companies do the basic work of starting and being successful as small and medium enterprises. SMEs are where the fight's going to be, right? And we got pluralists in the house. This is not, there's a lot at stake, but there are so many good things happening. And the idea of just getting more investment happening, more investment flowing, and I don't know, Patrice, you guys should talk, we've got a startup right here. How do we make sure that there's enough risk capital, but then also mid-level capital so you can actually scale? I have seen so many great startups get to the 3rd floor, but they can't get the capital to get to the 7th floor. So they kind of flatline and plateau, right? If you saw the demise of Vice and BuzzFeed, lack of innovation. They went out on the market to sell their companies off, right, and stopped innovating on the news and journalism side. That's why they're going out of business. So I don't want us to ever leave a conversation like this and thinking that the market can't be successful. It can be. It needs to be tuned successfully. And just one final note, I can't overstate the importance, I think, to the US citizen and consumer to have Europe as a successful partner, right? We depend on each other, right? Americans tend to think of the transatlantic alliance as sort of UK-ish because we watch a lot of British TV, but all of Europe is our partner in this fight because we are aligned on so many different fronts, but we have an ability to impact collectively. And so a shared unity of purpose to get this done, I think, is really required to move forward.
Great, thank you very much. You created your own thing, right? What motivated you to do that? So that we can shed light on, you know, how do we create mirrors around or ripple effects of what you're doing?
I think you have a number of people, mirror I would put over me in many ways, who have had to work in a lot of different spaces in journalism. So I've worked in public broadcasting, I've worked on the government funding side at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I have worked with philanthropy, I've probably unlocked $200 million of philanthropy for journalism. I've owned a newspaper, I've trained with Frank. So we have figured out a lot of ways to get more capital into the space. What I decided for myself is, unless somebody, we need a few players who are working in between the keys who are all about the relationships. So I'm not a journalist by training. I'm not an owner of a newspaper by training. Like what I'm good at and what I sense is missing often is the relationship building. So I get really inspired by the diplomatic efforts to bring these conversations to bear, because in some respects that's what Studiotobe is trying to do also, is connect funders to good actors to really take on the problem, but unlocking creative energy is really the most essential piece to finding the way out.
Sure, thank you. I suppose again,
you had a question
yes, no,
in
I
the
do.
back.
I'm about to
Yeah.
bring her in actually.
Yeah, sure.
But before I do, the one thing that we do also need to address, I think we're not doing this enough, is the TikTok or Insta generation, and the fact that when we have crises, we know that those are the channels that are infiltrated, and we don't have sufficient safeguards in place for protecting.
I have a very simple
truth
solution.
information.
If we can demonstrate that a harm is done by misinformation, charge the platforms $1 per harm. I mean, that's a simple regulation.
Thank you. Crystal. For the benefit of everyone, please introduce yourself.
Thanks. I'm Crystal. I work at Friends of Europe with the European Young Leaders Program, and I have several questions, but I'll focus on one. Building on comments that you, Dharmendra, made, and Ambassador, talking about autocracies and why are you afraid of the truth. If we're looking inwards, I know that Greece was recently ranked as the worst performing in terms of media freedom by Reporters Sans Frontières, and they've put down the report as last year was crap, quoting, and this year was another word that they used. And if we look towards France, just a bit south from here, the journalists, there's a consortium of journalists has also called for investigation in the way that the government and police are treating international and national journalists in France. So I know the question that we're exploring today is funding for media to sustain democracy. But before sustaining, should we protect the ones that are actually trying to do their work and not being supported by the governments? And for example, Greece also has been accused of spying on journalists and also selling the software to what we call autocracies. So isn't the problem also starting inside?
Thank you.
Want me to
Mark,
respond
if
to
I
that?
may.
Well, first of all, I hope my comments were unambiguous on that. You know, I grew up believing in the First Amendment. I quoted Thomas Jefferson and the role of the government in protecting the right of free speech, including journalists. It's axiomatic that no member state of the European Union and no state of the United States or the federal government can persecute journalists. That's the exact contrary to what our democracy stands for. My only point was, it's not enough. Even if you stop the most abhorrent behavior from spying on journalists to killing journalists, just obviously that's got to stop. That's not enough, because that will not create an environment where quality and truth prevail. And you know, certainly it won't prevail if you kill the truth tellers, but even if you stop killing them, you have to have a market in which quality and truth are compensated for. Otherwise, we used to have that in the United States. I think we used to have it in Europe as well. So to be clear, I totally agree with what should be explicitly prohibited. And the fact is, much of what happened in Greece and in the other countries that got poor scores from the Reporters Without Borders, that's the survey you're referring to, is illegal. It's a crime. You know, the question is there political will to prosecute the crime? That's a different question. But you know, that's actually not, from an intellectual point of view, a hard thing to figure out how to solve. It's a hard thing in terms of political will and courage. That's a different question.
Absolutely, and I'll bring you. Thank you very much, Mark. But Crystal, I think you also point to a very deeper issue. I think is about the values underpinning the union, and the fact that we're going through extension processes for the Western Balkans and other countries, and what's happening on our doorstep? Greece, Hungary, Poland, etc. So we need to kind of square that, or rather deal with that. I suppose schizophrenia about values.
Let me make a point on that, which I would love to hear Patrice respond to this as well. I think ultimately the solution to that and disinformation, or what's going on in Greece, or what's going on in Hungary, or Poland, even member states, is you have free, independent, sustainable, profitable media with a good investigative journalists. They're the best check on that in those countries. They're better than any other government or EU intervention, as important as all of that is. If you don't have independent journalists operating, you'll never stop this.
Sure, indeed. I suppose the issue that we're encountering is that increasingly, when you think of Greece, well, we think about Malta.
Yeah.
You know, the death of a very well-known journalist,
Yeah.
and we're seeing a rise of women in particular who are now entering the political space and getting notorious, but are actually are scared for their lives and their protection, and they don't know where to turn in terms of who's going to protect them at the end of the day. And it's not simply a gender issue, but it is a gender issue insofar as women are being targeted globally on this issue.
Big problem in Romania, by the way.
Yeah,
women being
precisely.
targeted. Yeah.
Precisely. You wanted to come in here, and we'll bring you in a minute. Please do introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matilda Cartanai. I work for European Endowment for Democracy. So I would like to go back to your comment that we should put the consumer in the center of attention, and I totally agree with that. But there is a but. So what about the countries, actually, that there isn't any alternative? For example, in the Western Balkans, the media is captured, and they don't even produce news, even though it might be biased. They just spread the propaganda of the government. For example, in Albania, there are the local elections in 14th of May, and it's really hard to find the source of the information. So, and it's also sad to see that. What we do at the European Endowment for Democracy is to try to find new actors, to support local media, community media, to engage throughout the Western Balkans, but also the other regions. But it's still hard, very hard, because they have to compete in this unfair market with big media, which is financed by government, by the politicians, or also unknown sources and the businessmen. There are quite many challenges that we see, and some needs also. Among the needs, for example, this is also maybe for other institutions that support media, is that we see the need for the repeat grants, for the flexibility when it comes to the grants, so when they need to even change the budget. So we need that because, and to provide that flexibility because of changing environment. But we, of course, cannot provide repeat grants all the time. So another way how we support them is once we have provided a first grant, then we try to provide strategic planning or business model for media, which some of, let's say, direction that we go, I also heard here. So this is one of the ways that we support, but I would like also to hear a little bit more how we can actually support or help the media environment.
Well, if Mira were here, I'm going to invoke Mira. I mean, there are a number of organizations that are really good at providing technical assistance to both civil society actors, journalists, new journalism organizations on how to try to diversify revenue streams, including philanthropy, how to advance technologically as fast as possible at low cost, responding to a marketplace that is totally captured or there's very little breathing room in the environment. This is where the advocacy has to really kick in, right? And don't know enough about Ascension, obviously, to address that in full, but I will say, can you buy an iPhone in the country? Can you buy a Samsung device, right? Like, the other missing part of our conversation, which often goes missing, is that the device companies in the mobile space, and we're talking about mobile, does anyone in here not have an internet-connected phone right now? Right? Have very, very little accountability in this conversation, right? So if iPhone decided that they were going to always put aside a fund for independent media in any country they sell iPhones, you'd have a lot of money to work with in Albania, right? So one tech company could change the world, literally change the world by saying, everywhere we are, we're committed to these principles and we're willing to spend money on it, right? So that's one layer. The second is, who owns the internet? Like, who owns, I don't know the answer to this in that country, but who owns the infrastructure for the internet, right? That's where all this stuff is sitting. And it never comes up that they have a role to play in ensuring that there is free expression and an independent press operating and accessible on their networks. They own the internet, right? So can you start to unlock some creative spaces around consumer protections, right? Is it a consumer protection issue if you can't get fact-based information over the internet you're paying for in your country, What if you get misinformation on public health? What if there's racial or ethnic violence promoted on those same networks? It's not just on Facebook, it's on the internet that Facebook is delivered on, never comes up in the conversation. So I would encourage, there's a layer missing also around consumer protection, which is partially why I'm saying put consumers at the center, because we have a whole infrastructure around consumer protection that we might be able to think about applying when it comes to ensuring that there is a free and fair and open, transparent space for information to flow in the internet, on the internet, with the internet.
Thank you very much. Did you want to come in?
No, I was going to remind Joaquin of, we have a very dear friend, Chris Warman. He told me something truly scary about the internet. If you think about what the PRC is really trying to do in the third world, is they want to own that backbone. Absolutely. And the reason they want to own it is for the very reason you're suggesting. You own that, doesn't matter what else happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also a space, again, engineers, these screens started getting designed in the 70s. It took 25 years for them to become $1,000 purchases, right? It took 35 years for them to become $200 purchases. There are people who build the internet right now. We never invite the engineers into these conversations either, right? There has been a strong movement inside of Facebook, now Meta, to hold the company accountable internally as well. So again, I'm looking for unlikely allies to increase the diversity of voices in the room, and also I'm looking for the money. Like, who has the resources to invest at the scale, right? And they're missing often, except he's got the money right there.
Yeah.
No, thank you. No, but in the last 10 minutes that we have, I'm absolutely going to bring you in. Can I just have the mic here, please? Now, I mean, do introduce yourself for the benefit of the audience and share that little story that we spoke about. I mean, what are you doing with so much money?
So I don't have money.
No, I know you don't have it.
So
I know you need to introduce yourself first.
My name is Patrice Schneider. I work for the Media Development Investment Fund. We are a 501c3 public charity. We're an NGO, and we, for the past 27 years, have been mobilizing patient capital to invest in the most independent voices in the worst country that have a history of media oppression, from Guatemala to Malaysia. So that's what we do, and it's not just, I'm not doing a pitch, I'm trying to bring it back to what Mr. Blethen, or Frank, if I may say. I want to thank you for the storyboard you gave us, which was, if I can sum it up, it's much more complex. So 32% EBITDA until the 90s from newspapers and suddenly the technology comes in and so forth, affects the revenue for the reasons you've well described. And then the third part of your storyboard was financial mercenaries, which I think is true. A bit summing it up, but if I may use that sum up, I would say that if we were to look at the prism of Europe, it was the same thing. I disagree with my colleague from Bulgaria. We forget what the tech's done in the 90s. As a publisher of Hachette, I remember what they did. The moment they discovered content is business, that's when they moved. So there was some sort of a first part of the scenario where the valuation of these companies, of independent media, were affected by tech. But this is where there's a fork that happens. We don't go towards financial mercenaries. But what we're seeing in Europe, well described by my fellow Europeans here, is not, it's autocratic-driven mercenaries that are using the valuation, the devaluation of these things, and not saying, we're going to make a buck, flip them, and Wall Street will be happy. In this case, Mr. Orban can now advise his friends that he can buy this because the valuation has been impacted. Now, where I want to be very honest in thanking you is that I hadn't thought about one thing, is that, as Neil Postman said in the 80s, what technology giveth, technology taketh. And we don't measure that. 40, 50 years ago, we truly believed that fuel fossil would actually drive human progress. Well, we now realize that the take it was a little bit bigger than what we thought. But it was a true and a genuine thing, and I think that's what's happening with technology. I think the moment has come to say that what technology taketh, and what it took, and I didn't know until I heard you, was the relationship of civil society to the information. When I try to teach a 5-year-old what I do, or what do? You raise money and then you go to Malaysia and you try to go against Mahathir? We monetize trust. we monetize, and this is exactly what, since Camille Dumoulin, the French Revolution, and the Swedes, because they pretend they had the first newspapers, they do. You will never get 100%. Fox will get a huge chunk, but there are people in the market that will actually monetize trust. And I think this is where it comes back to a potential of a solution, which goes back to the civil society, and I thank you for that, is that we've raised now, against this media capture, we are going after 100 million euros. We've now raised 50 million. We've tried 3. I'm happy to announce here that the 3rd transaction, so we've stopped the decapture of Slovakia's SME from an investment group. They were financial missionaries, but they were at the helm of the government saying, please control that agenda. The Rzeczpospolita in Poland, with 22 million, we stopped Orlen, a state-owned gas company, buying the Wall Street Journal of Poland. How oxymoronic is that? And finally, we're going to announce that in the Western Balkan, the board accepted it yesterday. Where I'm going with that,
Seattle Times if you want.
well, where I'm going with that is that, okay, Patrice, we got it. Pluralis is the tool, those 100, it's for plurality of media. But what we hadn't thought about, and you brought to light, is plurality of capital. Because I believe, of course, that we came up, and it's not exactly, I'm not making a link to what you said. The link is coming. Plurality of capital means that no government, but we get banks, we get foundations, but not just foundations. We get reputable media companies that say, you know what, if this thing keeps going, it's going to hurt the whole ecosystem in Europe. Thirdly, banks. Banks now, we're about to announce a bank that says, wait, I have business in Hungary. They could come after me. Well, now it's come to the point where those private banks are saying there's so much of a cost of having the public discourse fall that it's going to hurt my bottom line. We've come to that point, and finally, affluent, high net worth individual and so forth. But where I'm going is that I think that what you're saying is that in the same way you monetize trust, in the same way that if you have a working, functioning system, whether it's in Niš in Serbia or whether it's in a local newspaper in Arizona, it sends a signal to civil society that we are here. We are here. So the take it of the tech was not just about the devaluation of this business model that worked pretty well and comfortably for a while, but it also has an effect on the tissue of civil society. And this is why I think the idea of pluralis is to bring in other actors, banks, people, civil society that say, hey, we have a role to play in this. I'm sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I wanted to thank you, Frank.
No, but what were you going to say about Western Balkans? Because you were about to announce it, then you got to stop. But announce it here. What are you going to be doing?
I will not until my board releases it. But I'm happy to talk with some of you. But I think I will say something. The elephant in the room is Hungary.
Yes.
And I know that's where you will go. But Hungary, we're not there yet. But I think, well, to be honest, I want to speak under the control if there's any Hungarian citizens here. So 400 news outlets bought by cronies, those mercenaries, what I call autocrat-driven mercenaries, to use your word, Frank. 400 news outlets. I have on my desk the script of 14 radio stations of one morning. It's the same script. I have it. I keep it. I look at it. 14 radio stations in 14 parts of the region. Same words, pro-Orbán. And if you want to touch media capture, I touch it every day.
That's what I mean by the swamp.
Precisely, Ambassador. Precisely, Ambassador.
Indeed. And, you know, a bona fide member of the European Union. And, you know, what are we doing about that? You know, how are we issuing Article 50, for example, for not following the values of the Union? But, you know, that's part of the contradiction in terms... Indeed. Of course it is, of course it is. No, not only. But thank you very much for that. I'm going to bring in our colleague from the Parliament, because I think it's important that we end with you to a certain extent before I ask the panel for any final comments. Do introduce yourself and share the news.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here on this warm day and making time for this very important topic. So I'm Samuel van de Put, and I'm with the European Parliamentary Research Service, where we aim to provide independent, objective, and authoritative research on policy issues, including media freedom, of course, and we provide that to both MEPs and the broader public. And together with my colleague Tarja, who's also here, we produced a short explainer yesterday on EU and US action to support media freedom. And I just want to reiterate how important that transatlantic bond is in doing that, and you know, it's been affirmed many times, and I think the EU and US are clearly in the forefront of this fight. And this explainer, which we'll distribute to all of you at the exit happily, and it's also accessible on our website, epthinktank.eu. We kind of offer a succinct overview of many of the issues we've talked about, but also hopefully can add some a new dimension also by specifically looking at some of the legislative challenges. I mean, for example, in the US, you have the Article 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a challenge that we need to think about. In the EU, we have legislation moving forward, like the European Media Freedom Act, and you can ask Tarja about that. She's an expert on it. So anyways, so I hope you find this helpful to digest what we've been talking about and to get some new food for thought as well. So thank you again for Friends of Europe for organizing this.
Sure,
and,
but you can't sit down without saying, what's the nub of what you're doing? What's the nub of what you're saying? You've done a good pitch, you've done a good brand, it's excellent.
All right,
but
thank you.
What's the document saying in a nutshell?
So what we do is first of all, we looked at the new ranking that was published yesterday, where we unfortunately see another gloomy year looking back. And what we look at here specifically is some of the things that are in the works. And I think that, for example, I mentioned the European Media Freedom Act, but in the US, there's also a lot of interesting momentum right now. With, for example, there was a press act also specifically to protect journalists that passed unanimously in the House in the last legislation and could be brought back and hopefully would be passed now. So this is what specifically we're also focusing on, regulation on SLAP, I think, which we should talk about. That's both in the works in the EU very concretely, but which is also being proposed and worked on in the US. So I hope that this can contribute to the conversation we've been having.
Thank you for responding to my challenge. That's very good of you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, that's it. Time's out. Just to panelists, any last thoughts, something you want to get off your chest at all? This is your time.
I would have hope, but fight hard right now. These conversations are essential, and as generative AI expands rapidly, we could actually influence its direction right now relative to all these questions.
Exactly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. We don't know where AI is going to go. It could be a disaster. It could be a godsend. We're going to have to control it, put a leash on it. I've learned so much about Europe in the last 3 days in your European press, and we're not in the same boat, but we're in the same ocean. And I tell you, if we don't solve this, I don't think either of the European Union or the American democracy, I don't think we have much of a chance over the next 25, 50 years if we don't get this fixed and fixed quick.
Well, I'll segue off of that point, because I think the biggest challenge we have is most people don't understand that point. They don't see the relationship. They think of free media as being just about killing journalists, and that's a serious, serious problem. But they don't understand that an equally important problem is that media, as their grandparents knew it, does not exist literally in large segments of both systems, in Europe and the United States. And if we can't find some way to regenerate it, none of the other things we're doing will matter. The person who understood this the two people who understood this from the beginning in the United States were Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And where are our Benjamin Franklins and Thomas Jeffersons right now? I think, by the way, the President of the United States gets this. Okay, he's got a lot of other things on his platter. But we need to build an agenda in both Brussels and Washington that truly addresses this. And I don't think we have. I think it's a very, very big problem.
Indeed, thank you very much. We are in search of them, those leaders of the past. Yeah. Not necessarily as a cookie cutter in present, but we are missing that sense of leadership and of the sense of time is running out and to act urgently with passion and integrity. Thank you all very much. And your point to Hungary, my only concern is that within a hiccup, it'll be bots doing the headlines, and as we know already, that AI-generated bot journalism is already here, and I think it's being, we're underestimating its prowess right now. And I think if we don't, as you say, if we don't do something about it, bots will be writing the news tomorrow. So let's not, that's a sad thought, but let's end on the happy thought of you doing what you're doing, but also the fact that, you know, we've got an entrepreneur and others who have got ideas. So just for in this group, there are some ideas that you should all speak to each other. And I think I love the fact that, you know, you're doing what you're doing in terms of the plurality of investment, but also using consumers as a driver for change and not losing sight of them. The only point is we mustn't lose sight of demographics. You know, we are going to live in the next 20 years where there's going to be a very big, different intergenerational conflict. And, you know, the people that are now teenagers who are just doing this, we have to wake up to the reality of what they will be as future citizens of the world. So we mustn't forget that we are tiny representation here in this room. We have to think about those who haven't got the same income as we do, don't live in the same places that we do, and actually have no choice other than to do this. And, you know, we shouldn't be critical and judging of it, but find ways and routes and pathways into that context. So thank you all very much. And Mark, can I just say, it's rare that you get someone who uses their office to, I'm not going to say too good, but to make sure that your passion for this issue, that you've led to and partnered with us to have this conversation. And you don't often get ambassadors doing that. So thank you to you for doing that. No, really, really. I mean that genuinely, not because that for me, that's what leadership is about.
To be clear, it's not just because I'm a Boy Scout that I did it. It's because it's the national security interest of the United States that in the United States and in Europe, there's predictability, there's the rule of law, that if, you know, as my president likes to say, the ultimate struggle of our generation, of this time in history, is autocracy versus democracy. And if that's the case, what could be more important than this?
Indeed.
Yeah, and, you know, we want that in Europe as much as we want it in the United States, because Europe is the indispensable partner to the United States. Indispensable. We cannot function in the world without a strong, independent, democratic Europe.
No, absolutely. But my point is that you don't often get this, and so wouldn't it be great if you know, your entire network of ambassadors across the world actually hosted debates like this? Because it's about raising the profile. That's what we need to see happening across the world. So thank you again for that partnership. Thank you to you for being a fabulous audience. Really, I said that in judging. No, really. You've been absolutely fabulous. Thank you very much. Look after yourselves, enjoy the sun, and then keep an eye on our website for the next events that we have for, you know, for your consumption, which will equally be of an interesting topic, I assure you. Thank you all very much. Take care.